To our next guest, Dr. Laura Williams. She is a microbiologist and assistant professor of biology at Providence College. Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. This is pretty cool what we're going to talk about today. But first, let me just introduce some of your past work. Includes time working at the CDC and working in research with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But today we're going to talk about what's known as predatory bacteria. So you and students at Providence College have been working on predatory bacteria, found some here on Rhode Island, and doing research on that and how it can really be used for good. So let's explore this a little bit, and then hopefully we'll have some time to talk about your work encouraging and motivating women in STEM fields. So hopefully we can get to that. So let's start off first by talking about what predatory bacteria is.
Sure. So predatory bacteria, these are bacteria that attack and digest other bacteria as a way of making a living. So every time I tell people this, because of my family, friends, random people that you meet that ask what you do, I say predatory bacteria and they immediately go, oh, am I in danger? Should we be worried? No.
Everyone get out your mask.
That's right. So if you're at home and you're like, oh my gosh, run for the hills. No, it's okay. Predatory bacteria don't actually attack human cells, but they will attack other bacteria. And that's not, even as a microbiologist, when I first learned about them, I thought that was surprising. Because you're used to thinking of predators as kind of charismatic big animals like lions and wolves and so forth. But these are in fact very small living organisms that make their living by attacking and hunting, essentially, other bacteria. And they're in Rhode Island.
And we have some in Rhode Island.
Yes.
So talk to me about how you went about finding these and getting interested in studying these.
Sure. So one of the main reasons that we're interested in studying these is kind of a downstream application.
Okay.
One of the things we know about current healthcare is that antibiotic resistance is a really big problem. So we know that the statistics from the Centers for Disease Control, they recently ran some numbers, and it's over 2 million illnesses a year, and potentially 23,000 deaths a year are due to antibiotic-resistant illnesses. So these are bacterial pathogens where there's no longer any effective antibiotics. And that's not something we're used to thinking about. Once the first antibiotic was discovered in like the 1950s, we just thought, that's it, we've solved the problem of infectious disease. And now we're having problems with microbes that are resistant to these drugs. So for us, we're interested in helping out with research to look at whether or not predatory bacteria, because they can attack other bacteria, could be used as a living alternative to antibiotics. Which might sound far-fetched and crazy, but there have been a number of studies done that are showing that this actually has a lot of promise, and it's a viable solution to the antibiotic resistance problem. So that's kind of the long view of why we're interested in it.
It's a very shortened version of the very long view, right? Because I'm sure it gets much more complicated than that. So thanks for breaking it down, less complex version. I think this is absolutely fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about what you and some of your students have done. When she walked in here, I have to say, she gave credit to her students for doing the brunt of the work.
Absolutely.
Recently published a paper about these predatory bacteria being found in Rhode Island. Talk to me a little bit about the process of being able to find these and what you did find.
Sure, of course. When I actually haven't been here for very long, so I got here in January of 2015, and when I arrived, one of the first things we wanted to do was, can we get our hands on some predatory bacteria from Rhode Island? So I had 4 students who started out in the lab with me, undergraduate students. These are all college students at Providence College. And I said, just go out and see if you can find some, which in retrospect was maybe kind of a bit ambitious. At the time, we didn't really know. So I'm like, just go out, it'll be fine.
Good for them.
And they did great. And they found predatory bacteria in a number of different locations. So we're currently working with a lot of different types of predatory bacteria that students have isolated and students are working with. And the paper that we just had published was a predatory bacteria that were found in Mount Hope Bay, so just near Bristol. And I had a student, his name is Brett Enos. He's a class of 2016 graduate. And he would just drive down to the coast walk out into the water, take a sample, bring it back, and that's how he got his hands on. It was a little more complicated than that. So when Brett sees this, he'll probably be like, look, it was harder than that. But essentially, he was able to, and the other students were able to sample sites around Rhode Island and bring these samples into the lab. And we were able to work with the predatory bacteria that can be found just in environments around the state.
It's absolutely fascinating. So when you're looking at these, doing the research, finding them, how exactly does it work? Because we're looking at this and hoping for what's to come next. So what exactly do they attack? What exactly do they eat? And how can that be beneficial?
That's a great question, and that's actually one of the major things that the students do in the lab. So once they get their hands on predatory bacteria and we can keep them in the lab and grow them in the lab, we start asking questions about precisely what you just asked. That's the next great question is, what can they do? So in terms of what can they attack, what other types of bacteria? And in our minds, we're particularly interested in, do we think they could potentially attack pathogens? So bacteria that cause disease. That's what we're really interested in. Can we find some predatory bacteria that are good at attacking bacteria that cause illness or cause disease? And so the students will actually, in the lab, they don't work with pathogenic strains because biosafety is very important. But they work with a lot of different types of strains, and they can get a sense of, does this type of predatory bacteria attack a lot of things? Or is it very specific for certain things? And what might that tell us about future applications? So, and they're excellent at this. They do all kinds of great work in the lab to kind of understand these questions.
Well, it has to be kind of fun to be thinking, even though you're working it has to be at such I don't know if cellular is the right word to be using, but such a cellular level, but to be thinking that it could impact so many eventually down the road, right? It has to be very exciting.
Yeah, I really love it, and I think the students are really motivated by it because they're answering questions right now, but the long-term goal, every question that we answer is a step closer to that, which is, for people who aren't familiar with science, that's the exciting but also frustrating thing about science is you make progress, but it's incremental progress, and over the long term you can look back and kind of see how every question you answered was a brick to kind of try to get towards where you want to go.
So if we're looking at this, something that came to mind when I'm trying to kind of put this together, puzzle things together, we're looking at bacteria and something that you wrote about on the website and listening to past interviews and things that you've done is that bacteria can be found just about anywhere and that bacteria can be very good. In this example, looking down the road, we're looking at bacteria hopefully being very beneficial. Something that came to my mind was like a fecal transplant, right?
Yes.
So using bacteria from someone else that you think, okay, it's kind of interesting, but bacteria being transplanted in one form to help. I mean, is that kind of what we're looking at? Just different forms of using bacteria eventually to help? I mean, different, but...
Absolutely, and you bring up a great point. So with this idea, fecal transplants, which I've taught this in my classes, and it's a great way to make sure everyone's awake.
Yeah.
Because all you have to do is say fecal transplants,
everyone's like,
and
what?
anyone who drifted away is like, we do what now? What?
Yeah,
what?
exactly. But fascinating.
But absolutely, and it works, is the thing. So for the particular condition that it's been most well studied for, a fecal transplant works. It's the best treatment we really have out there.
Yeah.
And this is the same idea where you're thinking of, and it's a shift in our thinking too. Up to this point, recently, we've been thinking of healthcare in terms of kind of on the chemical side of things.
Yeah.
Which, that word is sometimes loaded now, but in a lot of cases, antibiotics are going to save your life. But what we're thinking about is, can we start to bring some ecology back into it, where we're thinking about living organisms and using those as a way to kind of partner with the antibiotics we have so that they can continue to be effective. So you're absolutely right. This would be a case where if we develop this, if this actually becomes a therapy or a treatment, people would be ingesting living bacteria that would then go on in their bodies to attack the bacteria that you don't want there. And that's kind of the ultimate goal.
Amazing.
Long way down the road.
Down the road.
We're closer than we might have thought a couple of years ago, which is exciting.
Right, scooping something up out of Mount Hope Bay.
Exactly.
So again, early stages, but where do we go from here? Where do you go from here, I should say?
Yeah, so for our lab, this paper that just came out, so it just came out earlier this year, that's the first paper of a whole set of data that we have. So we've had a number of students. I have 8 students working in the lab right now. A couple of them, I'll just list some names so
Sure.
they get to kind of hear themselves. So Molly Oser, Carla Martinez, Angie Casale, Luke Zappia, Joe Mangiamele, so I can go through the whole list of people.
It's fine with me.
But they're all in the lab right now, and they are getting really close to having their own papers ready to publish.
Congratulations.
And those studies are looking at kind of a broader question of trying to understand if we're thinking about predatory bacteria in the environment and developing them into therapies, what we'd like to know is what's available out there that could be used as a tool. So right now we're kind of describing what you might call diversity or variation in predatory bacteria. So for all the predatory bacteria that we're picking out of different sites in the environment, maybe one is especially good at attacking pathogens, and so we might continue on with that one. And so we're kind of laying the groundwork to be able to move forward to the next step.
Okay. So, do you know, are there other, I'm sure you're in touch because of your background and your research in other places, are there people doing this across the nation?
Yeah, it's funny because there's not as many people in this research field as I would have expected, because I think it's fascinating, so I'm a little biased. But yeah, there are a couple of other groups in the United States, but then there's also groups overseas, international groups. Some of those groups are a lot farther along with the proof of concept type experiments that would say, could you use this in people? No one's done any tests, to my knowledge. No one's done any tests in humans yet, but we've done tests in other ways that suggest, yeah, this could really work, and it makes sense to kind of continue it. And it's a small community, but a really helpful community too. So we've been in touch with a lot of those researchers. In some case, they've sent us some materials, and they've sent us a lot of advice, which we really welcome as well.
I bet that's also super helpful for students moving forward, because they can connect if they're interested in any of these fields. They can connect, communicate, talk, and that has to be really helpful for 5 years, 10 years down the road, advancing science, advancing medicine overall, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the exciting things for me being at at Providence College, and certainly working with undergraduate students, is it's difficult because they leave you after, they're doing all this great work, and then they graduate, and you're like, no,
don't graduate, you were good at this.
You're so good. But it's also really exciting because you get to see they're going to go off and they're going to do amazing things. And they're going to follow different paths, and some of them might continue on with scientific research. Some of them may not, but in all cases you kind of get to see this is their launching pad, and so you kind of get to see where they go. And some of the folks in my lab have expressed some interest in going on into graduate school and continuing with science. And so it would be really exciting to see if they decide to do that, where they end up.
Was the young man that published the paper, was he undergrad?
Yes, yeah. All undergraduates, yeah.
That's incredible.
I know, yeah, they're amazing. They really are.
That's incredible.
He did. I'll tell a quick story about him, which might embarrass him if he ever watches this. So he went to a scientific conference, and you stand in front of a poster, and people come by and you tell them about their work. And later on he told me, he was like, somebody said that I didn't have enough authors on here because they didn't believe that I did all of this. And I said, well, that's probably because they found out you're an undergraduate student, but that gives you a sense of how great they are and how much work they've done. And that's true for all of them. They're every single person in the lab.
Wow.
Who I did not list everyone, but they're all really doing amazing work, and it's exciting to kind of see them get excited about it too.
That's truly remarkable. So we look forward to hearing about what comes next.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, geez, you'll have to come back.
Yeah.
Before we do let you go, Laura, I do want to talk to you a little bit about, because this isn't the only field that you are interested in. You're also working to encourage more women in the field of science, technology, and math, engineering, math. I also like to throw in art there sometimes, because we like to talk about STEAM. Yep, exactly. Yep. I always like to highlight women in science, and so talk to me a little bit about why that's important for you.
Yeah, I really think that, so at Providence College, we're working on getting a Women in STEM initiative started for our undergraduate students. That's certainly not new. There's a lot of institutions, both educational and even in the corporate world, that have women in STEM groups and women in STEM initiatives. And I think one of the key things with this is just the idea that we're looking to try to make sure that opportunities in science and technology, engineering and math are really available to everybody who has an interest, everybody who sees that as their passion. They have a path available to them in which they're supported and encouraged, and we make sure that we kind of nurture folks that are headed down that path. There's some specific things we can address for women in STEM initiatives. At PC, we're also, on the side of that, we're also thinking about making sure both our men and women students kind of have all these opportunities available to them. But sometimes we find that there's some unique situations faced by women, and it's best to kind of have a group that they can think about that, talk to other people, learn a little more about what's available to them and how to handle certain things if they run across them in their careers.
And I think it's always interesting and encouraging when you speak to women, letting people know, like I've talked to women scientists before when they go out and they talk to people, they're talking to younger students, and you ask, what do you think a scientist looks like?
Yeah, yep.
And I always find that so interesting. They never say just anybody, right? It's always a very specific picture. So I think
lots of white lab coats and
Yeah.
lots of like white crazy Einstein hair.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think it's important to highlight that a scientist can look like whoever you want it to be.
Absolutely.
A scientist can look like you and me.
Absolutely, yes. And that's the thing that I think, to kind of continue to talk about my students, but I mean, they're scientists, you know?
Exactly.
And I think it's also helping to convince these students that they're scientists as well.
Yeah.
Because when you're in college at this level, you kind of used to thinking about yourself as a student, and this is a great time to transition into thinking about, no, I'm a professional in this field. I'm doing this work, doing this research. I am a scientist. And I think that's an important thing too.
Providing access, breaking barriers to anybody that wants to be in the field
Absolutely.
of STEM fields, STEAM fields. I think that's super important. So
Yeah.
please continue to provide those access points, continue mentorship. I think that's incredible.
Yes, we will happily do that.
Awesome. And come back
Yeah.
and talk to me about this more. Come back and talk about your research, talk about your students, talk about predatory bacteria. Fascinating. I love it. I think it's so cool. Hopefully I understood it just enough to think it's that cool.
Yeah, great questions. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Yeah, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come talk about this. Because
Awesome.
we're very excited about it.
Awesome. Congratulations to all the Providence College students that are doing great work there as well. Dr. Laura Williams, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to take a quick pause and get set up here for our next guest on Go Local Live.